Welcome to the Neurosurgery Podcast. I'm Mike Wang, and I'm here with my co-host, JP. We are here to discuss all things neurosurgical.
Hi, this is JP Kolcun, a resident in neurosurgery at Rush University. Please note that this is not a CME event. The opinions and statements on this podcast do not reflect the positions of any institution or professional organization. So with that, let's get started.
The title of today's podcast is Rockin' a Sub-Eye. Our guests are Rick Komotar, who is a professor of neurosurgery at University of Miami, and he's our program director, and Greg Basil, who's one of our residents at University of Miami. Welcome.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for having us on.
Great. So today's podcast is one that it will be of great interest to people joining our ranks. Each year we know that many more medical students apply for neurosurgery residency spots than there are openings. So it's a really competitive process, and we're going to try to peel some layers off that onion in the next half hour. So let's get started. So, Greg, I'm going to begin by asking you about how you felt about the sub-I process, and maybe then have John Paul weigh in as he kind of just went through it recently, okay?
Sure. Yeah, for me it was a super exciting time. I think it was the first time that I actually began to feel like I was a neurosurgeon. I was becoming a part of this neurosurgical community. But obviously, it's a very stressful time as well. You feel like you are being judged throughout the process, which is true. And it's also a very expensive time. It costs a lot of money to do all these things. So you kind of have a lot of things going on at once. But I think we're going to get into some of the details of those things as we move on in a podcast.
Yeah, I agree with Greg. This is one of the more important decisions that an applicant can have is where to do your sub-Is, how many sub-Is to do. So we take that very seriously here at the University of Miami. We always meet with all of the students before they select their sub-Is, go over their application process, see where they want to be in the country, what level of applicant they are so that they apply at the appropriate programs.
John, what do you think? You just went through this, right? I mean, I've heard, it's harrowing now, right? You traveling all over the country, new places. Tell us about what you just went through last year.
I think one of the most interesting parts of the process for me was this was the first time I saw other hospitals and met other departments, seeing how people do things elsewhere, how different systems work. Certainly it was harrowing. One of the most difficult things logistically was just organizing where you're going to live for a month in each city, how you're going to get around. You're obviously not going to have a car there. Rentals can be expensive. Trying to get the lay of the land on such a tight schedule moving between cities and institutions, it can be hectic. So planning in advance is highly recommended.
Yeah, and that's hopefully what people get out of listening to us today. So, it's really interesting. We get a number of sub-Is coming through here, and I know, Rick, you handle a lot of these applications, and you're going to give us some insight on how you can match at University of Miami, right?
Correct. So I think when you're picking sub-Is, there's a couple of factors that you need to be kind of cognizant of. First is, where do you want to end up? So the idea that you have to do bicoastal sub-Is to me makes no sense. If you want to be in the East Coast, you should do your sub-Is on the East Coast. If you want to be in the Midwest, you should do your sub-Is in the Midwest. And if you want to be on the West Coast, you should do your sub-Is on the West Coast.
Now, I'm going to stop you there because when I was applying back in 1995, that's exactly what I was told. I was told that if I did all my sub-Is on the West Coast, which I did, nobody would take me seriously on the East Coast program.
Yep, and that's a rumor that goes around, but I can tell you as a program director, if someone is willing to pay for a flight, hotel, they fly out, they interview with you, clearly they're taking your program seriously. So we interview top applicants that are from the West Coast that have not done sub-Is on the East Coast. We have ranked them highly. They have matched here, and vice versa. So I always tell applicants, if you're deciding where to do sub-Is, I wouldn't worry about having to cover both coasts. I would go wherever you want to spend the next 7 years. That's one part of the process. The other thing is you have to pick sub-Is that kind of match your level of application. So if you are an average applicant, you're coming out with board scores that are not superior, you're coming out with maybe a very few pubs, and you're not at the top of your class, you really want to be sure that you apply to programs that you're going to be, that you will be competitive at. You don't want to apply to the best programs if your application's not the best, because those are tryouts for 1 month, and those are your best chances of really matching. So we always meet with all of our students prior to them picking sub-Is. We go over their board scores, their research, What's their position in their class, what are their goals, and the top applicants are pretty clear, and those are the applicants that really should be looking at the top programs. Students that are kind of middle of the road should be looking at lower tier programs so they can improve their chances of matching.
But Rick, let me just stop you there, because I mean, as neurosurgeons, we all think highly of ourselves, right? Every applicant thinks they're a superstar. Every program thinks they're the best, right? So how do you make that marriage happen in a better way, right? Everybody thinks they're a 10, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of talks where you kind of bring the applicant back to reality. It's not always easy, but I feel like they need to know going into it. And that's why it's important for applicants to meet with your program director early. You don't want to be meeting with them after you've already picked your sub-Is, it's the fall or it's late summer. You want to meet with your program director early. And by that I mean January, February of your third year. So you're picking out sub-Is. And it is very difficult because sometimes I do have to bring people back to reality and let them know that, look, you may not match, or you will match, but you've got to apply broadly and really apply to lower tier programs to ensure that you match. And that's a very tough discussion, but it's better to have it then than to have it when they have not matched.
Well, that's great advice. So with that in mind, I mean, why not do like 30 of them and see what happens?
Yeah, that's also changed. I feel like, back when I was applying, which was 2004, people were doing 2 sub-Is, 1 at home, 1 away. That became 1 at home, 2 away. Now there's people doing 1 at home, 3 away. I personally think that that's excessive. I tell people you should do at least 1 at home and 1 away. If you have the time, you have the financial resources, and you want to get a third sub-I in there, that's fine. I personally think 4 is a little bit excessive, but if you enjoy it, you want to do it, you have the resources and the time, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was applying, which now we're talking about almost 4 years ago, the standard was pretty much everybody was doing 3, and 1 at home institution and 2 away. And then there were people starting to do 4, and I've heard more and more people doing 4 now, but there's definitely a practical component that you've kind of touched on too, is that we all have kind of limited resources, certainly as medical students, and that definitely becomes a factor in your way rotations. I think the other thing to consider, which Rick, you can comment on this, is that the places where you do sub-Is are not necessarily where you're going to go. It's great if it ends up being a good fit, but you don't have to do a sub-I to match somewhere, right?
Yeah, correct. It does give you an advantage if you do a good job. I can definitely tell you here at Miami, if someone comes to do a sub-I and they really impress us, obviously they're going to be ranked highly because there's a lot less risk in taking that person. You've seen them for a full month. It's much harder to kind of disguise any type of pathology. So I think sub-Is, if you do well, definitely help you. At the same time, doing multiple sub-Is, it's very easy to kind of shoot yourself in the foot. Because sub-Is, as we'll get into later, I truly think it's a very difficult job. It's 1 month tryout. You want to be recognized, you want to be remembered, but you don't want to be annoying. And that's something that I think Greg did a great job of when he was here, so did JP. Maybe you guys can talk a little bit about the delicate balance of being seen but not being heard, working hard, making an impression but not being annoying.
Right, so having just gone through this process myself, I think that was certainly one of the most difficult aspects of it, and one of the finest skills it helps you to hone. I think in order to tread that line between annoying and helpful, you have to really understand how the service works and how the hospital works where you're currently rotating. So being familiar with the people on the team and the tasks required by that team each day, and then being able to help them without getting in the way, without being constantly underfoot, just not being annoying in itself demonstrates that you understand the functions of the team and what you have to get done each day, which is a skill and knowledge set in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a pretty good situation now to kind of give some advice on this, because I can see it from the perspective of the sub-I and also the perspective of a resident. And, there's a couple things that you can do to be really, really helpful. The first is to keep in mind that all of the juniors, specifically the junior residents on service, are very, very busy. They have a ton of work to do. So anything you can do to help them to make their day a little bit easier, even if it's not super fun or exciting, like changing dressings or having a really good list done in the morning, those are like really low-hanging fruit.
Well, Greg, you mean like getting them coffee, washing their
No,
car?
no,
What
no,
do you
no.
mean? What exactly do you mean?
No, nothing like that. What I mean is, if you think about the fact that you're potentially, if you're lucky, going to be a first-year resident in a year, and if you could mentally put yourself in the shoes of that first-year resident and think about what tasks could someone do that would make your life easier, I think that is the most useful thing.
So let me ask you about something that's a little bit maybe off the wall, because none of us have personal experience with this, except, some people are going to go do a sub-I and they're just going to blow it. They're going to either feel it or maybe they're going to hear it directly. What do you do with that scenario? Like, like someone comes and like, okay, Greg, you've been there, right? Guy came out from University X, medical school, and they just really sucked on service, and they're like, what do you do with that? Can you like take it as an exempt class, or like is it on your record forever? What do you do with that?
I mean, you're done.
Well, I think
I gotta be honest. It's.
I mean,
Pediatrics,
I can
right?
tell you from a program director standpoint, it's so competitive nowadays, and there's so many incredibly qualified applicants that the margin for error is slim. And unfortunately, you got to look at board scores, you got to look at grades, you got to look at research, letters of recommendation, quality of the school, personality. But if someone blows a sub-I where they're there for a month and they either don't perform or they act, in a very inappropriate fashion, there's no coming back from that. It's too competitive. There's too many applicants that have done a good job that have just the same board score. So unfortunately, in today's competitive environment, very difficult, if not impossible, to come back from a bad sub-I.
I mean, is there like a secret cabal where you guys get together as program directors, like, even though you didn't write them letters, like, oh my God, well, they probably call you, right, and say, tell us about this guy, right, or gal.
So everyone should get a letter from every sub-I. You don't want to do a sub-I as an applicant and not get a letter, because that is kind of a red flag. So every single sub-I you do should have at least one letter. So if you do 2 sub-Is, that should be 2 letters, and if you do 3 sub-Is, it should be 3 letters. It should come from either the chairman or the program director or a highly visible attending. So just because you're friends with one of the junior attendings who's been there 2 years, I do not recommend getting a letter from them. Again, this process is so competitive and there's so many applications that when we get a letter from someone who is notable, who we know what kind of letters they write, who is reputable, we're going to take that letter much more seriously than someone who we haven't heard of, we've never seen their letters before. It's much harder to kind of decipher what that letter means. So your letters should come from high-level people. And then if the letter is lukewarm, that's a signal for the other programs to call. No one's going to badmouth you on a letter of recommendation. No one wants to put it in writing. But there are definitely code words that are said in letters such that programs know, call, there's more than kind of meets the eye here.
And I think, Rick, that's a good question, and you'd probably be able to answer that one as well. But how do you go about, getting those letters? I mean, presumably we're going to be asking you or Dr. Levy or Dr. Wang here for a letter of recommendation, but we may not have a ton of exposure to you directly over the course of that sub-I. So how do you go about gathering information on an applicant? Is it what the residents say, what the other attendings say, and how do you recommend working that balance while you're on the sub-I, spending a certain amount of time in the OR so the attendings know who you are, but also being helpful to the junior residents?
Yeah, I mean, so first thing is I would not be shy about asking for letters. Every program director, every chairman, every attending knows that sub-Is are going to ask for letters, so no one's going to be upset that you ask them for a letter. I would ask for the letter early so they have time to kind of put it together, and I would not be shy. In terms of making sure the letter is good, you have to realize that the attendings are obviously very busy. They have a lot on their plate, and their letter is mainly going to be based off what the residents say. So if someone does a sub-I here at Miami, yes, I work with them in the OR. I talk to them here and there. I see them in clinic, but the vast majority of my interpretation of someone's sub-I comes from the residents, because the residents work with them basically 24/7 for a month. So most chairmen, most attendings, most program directors are going to talk to the residents and say, how was this guy as a sub-I when they write the letter? Yes, they can look at your CV and they'll see your boards and your grades, and that's important for the letter. But what type of quality applicant you are as a neurosurgeon. How do you interact on service? Are you a team player? Are you technically competent? Are you socially competent? All of those are going to come out from the residents. So I would tell applicants that it's easy to kind of get lost and be like, well, I really want to spend a lot of time with the chairman and the program director, and I'm going to ignore the residents. You're definitely shooting yourself in the foot. Residents are the ones that basically write your letter, and you have to make sure that you get in good and you spend time with the residents.
So we're all kissing Greg's ass. I love it. So, but let me ask you, so going back to blowing it, so you already blew it, right? So Rick, what's the bigger red flag? No letter or lukewarm letter?
No letter.
Wow. Okay. So make sure you get letters. And I was going to ask you about, like, after people get the interviews or they come for somebody, like, there's this whole thing with the millennial generation. I'm not a millennial, and you aren't either,
Nope.
right? Like the writing of thank you notes and all that, like handwritten, typed, email.
I got to be honest. We get a lot of thank you notes, and 9 out of 10 piss me off.
Yeah.
It's just so over the top. But every now and then you get one that is genuine, and you can tell it's genuine by the way it's written, by the way they interview. They truly do love the program. They truly are grateful for the opportunity to actually be there and interview. What makes it genuine, I don't know, but there's definitely, you can tell when it's genuine versus something that literally cut and paste all the attendings, and they just change the name of the university. That's not a good step forward. But if you truly like a program, if you interview, let's say 10, 15 programs, and there are 2, 3, or 4 programs that you truly love and you had a great experience, it's not bad to write an individual letter to the program director or the chairman or an attending that really took you under their wing. But to do it, over email and just cut and paste, you're not fooling
You've gotten
anyone.
the ones where it's like a cut and paste, but it has another guy's name on it. I get an email, dear Dr. Komotar, I really enjoyed spending time with you.
Or it's like a
Great
different
interviews."
font with like a different color lettering. You could tell it's cut and paste. Yeah.
And to be honest, I think a lot of people worry. Do people care about that? Do they not? Should I send it? Should I not send it? But I think what I'm hearing from you, and I'll tell you from my perspective in the resident room, in general, when people hand out thank you cards, it can be a little bit pedantic.
Sure.
And I don't think it's necessarily well
Cigars,
taken.
chocolates, okay, but thank you for
Cigars as long as they're Cuban.
So let's go back to John. I mean, John, you're our co-host here. You just went through this. Tell us, maybe walk us through the average day of what was it like? Like, we got listeners that are maybe in college or they want to be neurosurgeons. They're going to go through this process. Prepare them mentally. Like, what is it one day kind of like, briefly?
So they start early, and you want to get to the hospital generally well before the first member of the team. Like Greg said, having a good list done in the morning, good numbers, all the information arrayed for the intern when they show up. You want to know the patients and the full service as well as the residents do, demonstrating that you're there, boots on the ground, sun up to sundown, really fully integrated into the team. At that point, it varies between institution. Generally, people round in the morning. You're there with them through that. And then you try to help on the floor as much as possible. Like Greg said, help the interns, help the junior residents. They're busier than you could possibly imagine. And so any way you can try to lighten that load will be appreciated, and you'll really meaningfully contribute to their day. At that point, if there's not anything going on, any academics or presentations, they'll generally send you to the OR. That's your chance to really interact with some of the more senior residents, the attendings, and typically stay there throughout the day, again, if there's not any other events. My rule of thumb was to never leave the OR till the last case is done. I just go around, try to be there as much as possible if nothing else is going on.
So when they try to send you home, is that a trick question, or is it a trap, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can just tell you, having been a resident, and it still sticks in my mind, that if you're doing a sub-I and the person on call is like, oh, there's nothing to do, just go home, you're doing a really, really bad job, and you're super annoying.
You're probably annoying people.
You're
And
super annoying.
I'll tell you what, one thing that John Paul was talking about, it can be really hard to figure out what time to come in the morning, right? Because there are going to be other sub-Is there with you. And in my case, I started and I asked one of the sub-Is, I said, what time are we coming in the morning? He said, oh man, there's this real gunner here. He's coming in at 4:30 in the morning. And so I started coming in at 4. And
That's why you asked.
And actually that gunner ended up becoming one of my best friends in the program. So shout out Jason Leonakis. We both ended up matching here. But so I guess in that case it was good for us. We came in early. We made the list. But It's a little tough. You don't want to be, I can tell you can definitely go too far. I had a guy walk in, we had a sub-I here, and I was on call that night, and 2 o'clock in the morning, he walked into the call room, and I said, hey man, what are you doing here? He said, no, I came early to make a list. And to be honest, the rest of us talked about it. It was kind of a red flag for us that this guy was 2 in the morning coming. It was like overkill, So you're always kind of trying to tread that line between being helpful but not doing too much. It can be tricky.
No, it is tricky. I think being a sub-I is one of the hardest things to do.
It's important to note there, obviously you're entering into some healthy competition with the other sub-Is, but I think one of the best parts of the experience for me was some of the cooperation with the other people in the field. You can make some really close friends of people who are in your cohort. They're about to go through the interview cycle with you. And you're together with them for a month just like you are the rest of the program. So it's a good chance to meet people, make contacts that you can swap stories with and gossip with in the interview trail that's about to follow. So don't be afraid to be friendly, even if the guy's coming in a half hour before you. That's actually a really good point. Another,
Rick has been talking about red flags. A huge red flag is if you see one sub-I who treats another sub-I badly, or who isn't helpful, or who is obviously trying to throw someone under the bus. We don't like to see that because we want to work with you. We want people that we like, that are nice people in general. So I would avoid that kind of behavior. I agree. One, because it's just not a good way to behave, but two, it doesn't go over well with the rest of the team.
John Paul, you introduced me to Jocko Willink in his podcast, and I love this analogy with Navy SEALs. And you think about Hell Week, that here's a pyramidal process where people are being eliminated, and in the end, the guys who get through it, they become best friends, but they're competitive, like you and Jason, right?
Yeah, it was a healthy competition, but we were friends, but we were kind of trying to outdo each other in terms of who did a better list or who got in earlier, but it never became unfriendly. It was always helpful.
I know we're going to address this in a future podcast, which we're going to be recording soon, but this issue of how female applicants integrate in that, because there is a lot of a competitive, athletic type of feel to it, isn't there? Rick, you do the softball tournament, right? You started that with Jeff Bruce, right? And there's something innate about what we do that's kind of like athletics, right?
Yeah, I think surgery in general has a lot of analogies to athletics. I think the teamwork, the dedication, the focus, the sacrifice you have to do to kind of be excellent in sports with the hand-eye coordination and the repetition, very similar to surgery. Along the lines of gender, I've been amazed. The last couple years, some of our best sub-Is are women, some of our best residents are women. So as long as the person has that innate drive and that dedication to neurosurgery, male or female, they're going to do excellent.
Great. Now, I really enjoyed my sub-Is and the interview process, and I spent a ton of money, but I made a ton of friends, and I still remember it fondly. But it gets expensive. So, John, you went through this right in 2018 and 2017, and how do you? Maybe you're independently wealthy. I don't know, but how do you pay for?
I wish.
You will be, but. Currently, how do you address that? How do you deal with the cost? Do you do it Airbnb? What do you do to get through this process?
So Airbnb can be your best friend. Certainly on the interview trail, I think I exclusively used Airbnb. Obviously, if you have friends or family in any cities where you'll be visiting for a sub-I, and then again on the interview trail, take advantage of them. Like Dr. Komotar said, don't be shy to ask for a letter. Don't be shy to ask for a sofa. For the sub-Is themselves, there are various services that connect students between schools. I'm sure they'll come and go with the years. My year was called Rotating Room. It's like an online forum. It connects you to students at other schools who are going on rotation the same time that you are. You can stay in each other's apartments. I stayed in someone's house in Virginia for a month. I used his bike to get to the hospital. So just being mindful for affordable ways to find housing, to find transportation.
What was that website?
Rotatingroom.com.
Okay, is that like an app you can use, or?
I don't know if they have an app. It's a website, and it connects. It's medical student exclusive, so it connects you to other students who are doing externships around the country.
It's like a youth hostel kind of thing for you guys.
It was a little cleaner than a hostel, but you're staying in each other's apartments and houses.
I would say that also you have to know what kind of a person you are. Some people can live in miserable, accommodations and bike to work every day and be okay, and some people need a little bit better. And I would say know the kind of person that you are. because that's important. The most important thing is that you perform well on the sub-Is, and I think whatever little bit of extra money that you end up spending to make yourself comfortable, if that's going to make you perform better, is probably worth it. I stayed in a friend's house, and one of the sub-Is I did, which I was fortunate that he lived in that area, I stayed with an 85-year-old grandmother here in Miami, which ended up being an amazing situation. She cooked me fresh dinner every night, But we didn't have that website. I was using Craigslist, and I was pretty nervous. I had to share a bathroom with her in a little house, but it ended up being my best living situation. I still keep in touch with her. But yeah, use whatever resources you have.
That's great. That's great. Well, this has been really instructive. Now, this is, I'm sure, partly an educational podcast for most listeners. So I would like to sort of end by asking our guests, some kind of a, educational factoid or fact or new knowledge in neurosurgery you could share with us and our listeners.
I'm going to let Rick kick that one off.
Wow. I mean, and this is dealing with anything in neurosurgery?
Sure. Anything even peripherally related to, sports cars or neurosurgery, anything. Tell us about this new machine that you have, the new histology machine.
So we've been trialing the Neo system. It's a Raman spectroscopy system with a huge amount of potential. Basically, currently when we take out tumors and you need a frozen section, spine, brain, doesn't really matter. There's obviously a huge delay. Can be anywhere from 20 minutes up to an hour, depending on where you're at. And that can delay the course of surgery and what you're gonna do next. So this machine allows you to get real-time images that look like H&E, that give a decent, accurate representation of what the tissue looks like within 3 minutes. And so
hold on. We're waiting in the OR for pathology for usually how long?
It's usually 20 minutes to an hour, depending on who's, time of the day, where you're at, who the pathologist is. And this allows you to get not quite a detailed image, but very close enough to make a diagnosis, usually within 2 to 3 minutes. And so I have a feeling this is going to change the way that we do intraoperative histology. That can really guide not only what the diagnosis is, but it'll shorten the length of these cases, and potentially even guide extent of resection. Basically, looking and seeing, is there any tumor left? Sometimes when you're on the margin of tumors, you're not sure if it's a gross total resection. This tissue or this machine allows you to look at tissue on the periphery and see if there's actually neoplastic tissue involved. So I think this is a major game changer. It's still being developed. We are still collecting data, but it's got a bright future.
So if you don't match in neurosurgery, definitely don't go into pathology.
100%. Pathology is out the door soon.
We hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe to our series. You can always reach John Paul and me by emailing us at neurosurgerypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.